Yeah.
Sorry,
I was
Alexis
like, you
and
sound kind of.
Tom, I'm going to temporarily step in because we're short Wes at the moment. Can you guys, am I you hearing me okay now?
Yeah, no
Yes.
problem.
Yeah, beautiful. So let's start with this session on this question of moral clarity and objectivity. This is the last several years we in newsrooms have had really big, meaty, challenging conversations on this topic. Can we start with how are you guys? How do you guys view that those phrases, objectivity, moral clarity? What do they mean to you, knowing this is a complicated and controversial concept?
You want me to go first?
I would
Sure.
love it if you went first, Tom.
Okay. First of all, there's a lot of confusion about the term objectivity. A lot of people don't understand its history and what it means. It did not come from lawyers, as I've heard some people say. It does not mean both sidism. It does not mean false balance. It does not mean political stenography. It does not even mean neutrality. Okay, here's a book about historiography.
He's bringing the
Objectivity
receipts.
is not neutrality. I brought the visual aids. The term objectivity came into use in journalism in the early 20th century at a time not unlike the one we're in now, where monarchical government was collapsing worldwide after World War I. The Russian Revolution had happened, and it was not clear to people whether democracy would, as an institution, was going to survive, or whether some new form of government on the left and the right, which was either fascism or communism, would instead. And there was a very famous critique of the coverage of the New York Times by Walter Lippmann and Charles Murs, 45 pages in the Atlantic magazine, in which they talked about confirmation bias. They didn't use the term default culture, but they could have in this piece, and talked about all the things that were wrong with the coverage of the New York Times of the Russian Revolution based on the cultural limitations of that newsroom. And they picked the best newsroom that they could find in the country. You have to remember, this is a point at which a lot of journalism was still kind of rising out of partisanship. What they meant from objectivity, and they took this term from German social science, and what they meant, and Lippmann even talks about that, he's calling for a more scientific spirit in journalism, meaning more transparency, more rigor, more discipline, show how you do your work. It did not mean neutrality. We have lost a lot of that meaning in the way people think about it. But if people, and there are a lot of reasons for that. There is a deep streak of anti-intellectualism in journalism. There is a kind of an apprenticeship model, a craft mentality. Just do what your city editor told you to do. These were not college-educated people in journalism to a large degree. And but if people think that objectivity, that the opposite of objectivity is subjectivity, or that objectivity means I have no point of view, I am a cipher, I am neutral, that's a misunderstanding of it.
Can we
the
actually
best of
pause?
our journalism is journalism that is so deeply reported that it has a point of view. Let me just make one other point and then I'll stop. A lot of people know the term the view from nowhere, which Jay Rosen has popularized to denigrate this kind of simplistic notion of objectivity, as objectivity is lack of consciousness. The term actually comes from a book of philosophy by a guy named Tom Nagel, and it is meant to say that the way you achieve an objective method of understanding the world, objective method, is by starting with your own, what he calls initial point of view, recognizing what that is, and broadening out from there to understand the points of view of people who see the world differently. He's a philosopher, not a journalist. But rather than the denial of one's point of view, it is a recognition as simply an initial point of view. And I'll just finish by saying, what worries me with the term moral clarity, if we decide let's adopt moral clarity as our goal instead of objectivity, first, we don't understand objectivity. We should understand objectivity properly. Second, if that's a crummy term because it's confusing, moral clarity may be worse because the Proud Boys have moral clarity. Nazis have moral clarity. White supremacists have moral clarity. It does not imply anything about a discipline of verification and deep rigor and open-mindedness and inquiry, which is what I think journalism needs to aspire to. I'll stop.
Alexis, you've had an interesting 2020. I'm not sure where you are in that journey right now, but I wonder if you could maybe set us up a bit about where you were maybe 6 months ago on this, and what your pathway to like Newsroom, what your experience with that stance has been in 2020.
Sure.
For maybe some folks who might have missed some of the journey you've had.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, at this point, if you Google like Alexis Johnson, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, it's all there. It's public knowledge. But yeah, I kind of got thrust into this national conversation about objectivity because I sent a tweet about like, I think it was the weekend after George Floyd was killed, and we were seeing, I'm a Pittsburgh resident at the time. I was working in Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh, grew up here, so, you know, very, you know, personal to me what happens here. And that we were seeing the protests here like they were happening all over the country, and there was some looting. And the following morning, I sent a tweet that kind of made fun of people who were complaining or criticizing the looters because, you know, every year we have a huge country music concert. Kenny Chesney comes, Luke Bryant comes, whoever, they trash the entire city. It happens all the time. So I was like, oh, you know, I pulled some pictures from the Kenny Chesney concert. I said, look at this trash that the looters made. Oh no, wait, it's just, you know, it's just Kenny Chesney pictures. And it ended up going viral. The next day, my editors at the time said that I had showed bias and that our readers would not think I was objective on this matter of race, of Black Lives Matter, of police brutality because of that tweet. And because of that, I could no longer cover the protests happening here in Pittsburgh or anything about the Black Lives Matter movement. So the quick recap of that is I'm no longer there.
I did put a link of our friends at Pittsburgh City Paper who's done some reporting on this.
They were great.
Folks who are catching up.
They've been hammering the whole thing out. But, you know, I guess the overall view of that was, you know, I kind of got called into this national conversation about what objectivity means, what is bias when you're talking about reporters, like, where does this idea come from? Who does objectivity serve? Are there two sides, as like a little bit to what Tom was alluding to? Like, are there two sides to racism, especially when we're talking about Black Lives Matter all summer? Like, what side should we be on? Is it biased to say Black Lives Matter because that means you're supporting a political movement? Or are we talking about human rights? My personal opinion is journalism should be do no harm. So, you know, there is no two sides when we're talking about discrimination, racism against certain people. My tweet definitely didn't show that. And if they said that it did, okay, because, you know, I want to be on the side that of history that shows that, you know, everybody should be treated equally and seen equally. And if that tweet was to call out a double standard of how, you know, Black people are looked at when they do damage after somebody dies at the hands of a police officer versus how white people are looked at when they go to a country music concert and do the same kind of damage to property. So basically that is what happened to me. And I am no longer at that establishment about 6 months later. It happened in June.
We're going to come back to that. Wes, I want to bring you in. Hey, Wes. Hey. You've also had a little bit of a journey over the last several years on your relationship to objectivity. I think Tom gave us a really good push at the beginning of the origins of where that word objectivity came into newsrooms, and perhaps it's been kind of like it's taken a journey. But I wonder if you could give us a little sense of where you are in your own newsroom journey of what moral clarity means for you. Tom had a push about how effective that term is for our purposes. I just wonder where you stand on this, because you've certainly been a voice.
Sure. I mean, look, I think that I think there are a few things, and you know, I start to feel like a broken record on it. But one is I think that, you know, the issue is not with the concept of objectivity as properly defined in terms of what the words actually mean. That no one no one who I'm aligned with or know is arguing against journalism that's fair, is arguing against journalism that seeks to figure out what the truth is, that no one's arguing against a reporting process in which you talk to a bunch of different types of people and hear them out and bring questions to them, right? No one's arguing against any of those things, but rather it's about it's two different things, right? It's about the reality that in a lot of our newsrooms, that the term objectivity has grown to mean a lot of things that objectivity never meant in the first place or wasn't intended to mean. That it starts to be swapped out for neutrality, which is not necessarily what's true. When I write about a murder, you shouldn't walk away feeling neutral about it. The murder is a bad thing.
Hot take, Wes.
Yeah, right. It gets swapped out for a balance, where if I interview 10 people on the street and 3 of them think the sky is green, I probably should not balance the piece out and have as many of them in the pieces as anyone else. That's not what it means. But beyond all of that, I think especially in this moment with social media, a time when the reality is journalists are showing more of themselves to the public than in the past, for better or for worse. I mean, we're here, genie's out of the bottle. What we often see is that we're not actually talking about, in these cases, journalism that is in some ways unobjective. Rather, we're talking about the theoretical perception of objectivity. Alexis didn't write a piece that was unfair. Right? There's no that all of this is this bank shot. Well, theoretically, if you as a human show that you are in possession of any opinion or personality, then theoretically on a future piece, no one will be able to trust you. And what I think the problem there is, and I've heard Tom talk about the history a number of times, right? One of the keys to a system of objectivity, of having a set of rules, how we go about reporting, is to accept as a premise that the individual journalist themselves does have biases. That's why you formalize a process and have a set of standards, right? And so for me, it seems incongruent that the point of an objectivity of process is to accept as premise that the individual journalist is going to have biases, is going to have, is going to have certain backgrounds, and the point is that through the process, you land at a journalism that is fair, that challenges those things, that looks for and so because of that, for me at least, it doesn't quite make sense to penalize people for expression of things that we've accepted as premise exist, that we're not robots. We're not, and in fact, I'm not, at a personal level, I'm not interested in going to a cocktail party with people who don't have any feelings about anything. Those people aren't fun. They're not interesting. I don't want to work with, as a journalist in a newsroom, with folks who don't have, who aren't passionate, who aren't engaged, who aren't thinking about what's happening, who aren't witty, right? And I think that, and so I think that there's a push and pull between those things. And look, what I also think is that, over the years, as this term has evolved to suddenly mean that the individual themselves is not capable or holding any biases, which again is the opposite of what the point was, it has started to set this internal culture within journalism in which many people believe they in fact do not have biases. And what I would argue is that in fact is detrimental to a pursuit of checking ourselves. That you cannot account for a bias if you won't even admit you have it. And I think that in fact one of the first steps towards doing fair journalism is going, well, actually, I feel like I find that person, I find that person sympathetic, and I think that person's the victim. Because then what you're able to do is say, all right, well, let me make sure I'm being fair. I'm hearing the best version of these people's arguments, that I'm asking hard questions of the person who I feel sympathetic towards, and I'm hearing the best version, the good faith version of the person who I think is the villain. If you just insist that you're a journalism robot with no bias, you're an objective journalist, suddenly you have no cause to do those things. And I would argue that we end up seeing a lot of journalism that ends up biased by the author, the reporter, the correspondent, because of their own personal insistence that they have no bias.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've watched polling numbers of the trust in journalism we know last 20 years have gone the wrong way. Is this reclarification of our position an attempt to improve those numbers, or is it the cause of those sinking numbers? And I got to feel like you might have some different opinions. Are we helping ourselves or hurting ourselves by readdressing this relationship to news?
Well, so I've spent a lot of time on those trust issues. I spent 16 years running the media research at the Pew Research Center, and intimately familiar with that trust data. The latest data, for those who don't know it, is that 10% of Republicans, just 10% of Republicans, say they have even a fair amount of trust in the mainstream media, and 73% of Democrats, and 40% of people who are registered as independents or self-describe themselves as independents. So the trust issue is not entirely, but it has a partisan component to it that you can't deny. At the same time, the trust issue is embedded in the fact that in 1973, 4% of people who worked in newsrooms were Black. And in 2013, 40 years later, 4% of people who worked in newsrooms were Black. So we don't understand these communities. We don't have people who understand them. We don't cover them. They're underserved. So the trust crisis is coming from newsrooms that have a default culture that has biases that, as Wes says, they're not aware of. They've internalized this notion that they are ciphers. They've misinterpreted the real meaning of objectivity. And we do a lousy job of covering both, various aspects of our community. The real crisis facing journalism, and particularly for these students, is mainstream media right now is a product supported by aging white liberals. If the news media does not find a way to reach people who are younger, people of color, and people who are more conservative, which is a range, not a monolith, then it will fail to create a public square with a common set of facts, which is what it exists to do.
And I wonder if newsrooms aren't helping reporters with having any clear sense of how we are meant to engage. Full disclosure, Alexis, I was one of the people who retweeted your Kenny Chesney tweet. So I'm sorry. I'm not sure. But I want to pull up. I'm going to do a poll, and while it comes up, you guys can talk. I'm curious about folks in the chat. If your news organizations actually have a policy for how you're supposed to engage on social. I'm curious how these last few years, how they've impacted your newsrooms. And this common complaint that Tom's alluding to, that we are seen as a partisan tribe, whether we like that or not, and curious how that you affect that. But Alexis, Wes, I'm curious about your own thoughts there about, are we going the right direction on those trust issues, or are we still floundering, do you assume?
Well, I think that I think there are a few.
Would you bet those trust numbers get better 4 years from now, or still go the wrong way?
Probably keep going the wrong way. If I had now, part of that's determined on what we collectively do in the next 4 years and what our politics look like in the next 4 years. So I think there are a few things around the issue of trust, right? I think that I would actually argue that, look, we're not politicians. Our job in the media is to tell the truth. At most points in history, there were significant truths that would have made you pretty unpopular to tell. That when Ida B. Wells is traversing through the South, having her newspaper burned to the ground because she has the audacity to say lynchings are happening to innocent people, I don't think she should have been checking her poll numbers to decide if she was doing journalism the right way or not, right? Our job is not to be popular. That is not in fact the point. Our job is to be right. And in a environment that is
But so let me push you a moment though, Wes. Surely at some point if everyone stops believing that Peter Pan can fly, like Peter Pan stops flying, right? Like at some point, there's some threshold where if no one believes what we do or say.
But the danger is we can't have if we live in a country that is polarized, in which we do literally have 40% of the country saying the sky is green on any number of issues. We shouldn't be so catering to those folks that suddenly when you read our pieces, you're wondering if the sky's actually green, right? That runs counter to the very concept of what we're supposed to be doing in a core way. We're supposed to tell the truth, right? If half the country decides it doesn't believe the truth, that's not really our fault, nor do I really think is our problem. And so, because the reality is, I don't want someone picking up my writing 100 years from now and going, what the hell is this idiot talking about? The sky's not green. The point is to be right. The point is to record the truth. And beyond that, I don't think we can have this conversation without the context of, look, when we look at the partisan polling numbers and 10% of Republicans trust the media, well, that's unsurprising because the Republican Party has essentially as a plank in its platform, do not trust the media. Go to a Republican convention, they're holding don't believe the liberal media signs that date back to the early 80s, right? That we can't pretend as if there's not an active and ongoing campaign to erode trust in the mainstream media, and that the people doing that campaigning are the people who don't trust the mainstream media. Those two things are linked, and so I think that's important as well. Like I said, I think for me there's a real, like I said, I don't think that our utmost goal is to pursue trust polling numbers. I think it's an indicator. I think it's a means of taking the temperature of the country and where we are and what should be happening. But I think that a big part of the reality is we are currently creating journalism in an environment in which the media is a whipping boy for one of the major political parties and movements in the country. That's been true going back to Nixon. So you've got 2 generations of Republicans who have been taught as a core tenet of their beliefs not to trust us. That's not to say we haven't at times done things that have helped that out. But I don't think that we can all have this internal journalism conversation and render our garments about this forever. I think equally important is that we don't do things in pursuit of people who are never going to trust us that undermine our credibility and our fairness, right?
Yeah, so I agree with that, Wes. It's fair. Yes, our job is to tell the truth. That is, what I write about in the Elements of Journalism. But if we tell it in such a way that people don't believe it, then we're also not serving truth. So I don't think our job is to pander to these trust numbers, but we have to be mindful of how do we tell the truth in a way where a growing number of people will accept it. Mm-hmm. Because part of our job, part of telling the truth is to, flood the zone so that falsehood doesn't prevail. So we have to be mindful of why is it that some people don't believe us, and some of that is because because there's bias. There's white bias, there's age bias, and there is liberal bias. Mm-hmm. And these problems, kind of exist there to some extent. There's a real risk if we say, oh, okay, we can't worry about. We can't do a racial reckoning in our newsrooms in 2021 because we've got to worry about conservatives instead. That would be horrible. That would be tragic. But we also, as I said before, we have to be able to, when we write these stories, have people recognize, okay, there's a lot of evidence there. They really talked to a lot of people. They've got the goods. I think we have to accept this. That story in the New York Times about Trump's taxes, I might not have liked the way some of the phrases in there. I thought it was a little biased, but wow, the facts are overwhelming. I'm going to accept I'm going to accept this as accurate. That's also an important part of our job, not just to find out the truth, but to convey it in a way where people have some receptivity to it.
I agree with that completely. And I think that a big chunk of this, frankly, is that I actually think a lot of the journalism that your average American consumes is not particularly good. And I think and I think that's as much of this as anything else. That even as people who work in the industry, when my aunt shares something on Facebook and I click on it and know that it's an aggregation of a thing, I know not to believe the headline because it's probably just made up. It's an overstatement or and what we have to understand. And so again, you look at something like the Trump tax reporting at the Times, and that's such an outlier in terms of the rigor of the work, the detail, the number of people talked to, the care and editing, compared to the average piece of journalism that I'm encountering in a given day.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Alexis, we're a little over time and we got to go to breakout groups, but I mean, something that we wanted to come out of this conversation and we want folks to continue in their breakout groups is like, what the hell should you take back to your newsroom or your organization in this moment? Alexis, you've had a very personal journey here with this, maybe more than anyone in the country right now. The poll results we got from folks that, maybe all over the place like you might expect on this topic. Some newsrooms seem somewhat prepared with some sort of policy, some not even quite sure. Has this era made us better or not? I guess it seems like not. Do we think we have a bias? I guess sorta, but maybe it's overblown. Alexis, if you were to be, starting a new news organization and you were trying to arm other reporters with how the hell they navigate this, are there any words or truths that you would want to take into any newsroom that they should be using to navigate getting this right, balancing what seems truly political versus what seems voicing truths?
Well, I gotta be honest with you, because despite the fact what happened to me, I'm still no expert in any of this.
Sure.
People have been asking me to show up and talk about these things because this one thing happened to me, and I'm just a reporter literally just trying to do my job, and I think we're all still trying to figure it out. But I guess my best advice would be, like I said before, it's to do no harm. And, when you're talking about these things about objectivity, and in right and wrong, think about who that served and who created, who at the top is enforcing these. If you have at the example of my former job where 95% of the editors were white, not even just people, not even not black, not people of color, just white people, period, that are overseeing our education coverage, our business coverage, our crime coverage, our arts and entertainment. It's who gets to decide what gaze we can look at these stories upon, when every time I turn something in as a Black person with my views and my background, it goes to an all-white board of directors, and they decide if they think it's okay for our 90% white audience and if they'll understand it and things like that. So I guess the only thing I would say is hire more people of color, retain more people of color, and make sure that people of color are getting into these positions where they can make these decisions, because I firmly believe that if somebody Black was in charge of my coverage and they made that decision, somebody would be wait, hold up, this probably is not the right thing to do, and all of this would have been resolved. But now the Post-Gazette is losing advertisers. They're not being sold at our local grocery store in Western PA, and all these things have happened because there just was not one person at the table to say, hey, maybe we should look at this a different way. So I guess that's the only thing I would say, is if I were to make a newsroom, put more Black people in it, put more people of color in it, and you won't have these problems, honestly, truly. That's what it really comes down to it. Because at the heart of this objectivity conversation is kind of always race, and whose social media accounts are getting looked at more than others, which, specifically happened in my situation. And if I'm a Black person talking about a Black issue, does that make me biased when white people talk about white things all the time, when white reporters talk about, that's just the status quo. So we don't see it as this kind of otherness of like, oh, let's make sure that you're not leaning too much towards, you know, racism or whatever else it can be. When, you know, we always have these kind of standard stories where, you know, if I made a Black restaurant list, and it was a whole conversation about like, oh, should we be doing this? Is this pandering, etc. But we have a best pizza list all the time, and it's just a bunch of white restaurants, and nobody says anything. So I think that's really come down to it, is like this whole objectivity thing kind of always falls back on Black people to kind of bear that responsibility, or journalists of color to bear that responsibility, to make sure that we're pleasing our, you know, our white audience and our white editors. And I think that's really where the discussion needs to be had.
Mm. That's well said, and perhaps as big a point as we can have. So we ran a few minutes late. That's on me, but this is a really compelling conversation. We're now going to throw everyone into breakout groups. This is how this day will go. We'll get